Well, let me introduce some of our panel here this evening, and then I'll kind of talk to you about how this is going to work tonight. So first we have Chief Will Johnson, and thanks for being here, Chief. And Chief has 24 years of law enforcement experience. He's been the chief here in Arlington for a little over 5 of those years now. And we are nationally recognized, we being a city and city police department, nationally recognized as one of the top police departments in the nation. And so, now that comes as no surprise to us because we've seen the integrity in which he leads. But he also is sought after on many fronts. He is a witness for Department of Justice. He also serves on the board of the IACP, which is the Human and Civil Rights Committee in D.C. And so just a number of things we're really grateful for. I got that right, the IACP. I was getting those letters all mixed up earlier today. So thank you for being here. And then we have David Balliet. And David has been a good friend for many years. David started a movement in South America. It began in Buenos Aires called No Más Violencia. And so I don't speak Spanish, but I know that means no more violence. And it's a great story. He'll tell a little bit about that tonight. And now he leads No More Violence USA. And he's also mission pastor here. And so, David, thanks for being here. And then Richard Harris. Richard and I met actually through Linnell and I's relationship, but Richard is a national speaker. He has spoke at national prayer breakfasts in Washington, D.C. He's sought after on many fronts because of his experience. So he'll share a little bit, so I don't want to spoil it, but Richard was the grand dragon of the Indiana Ku Klux Klan for many years. And eventually, and I'll let him share his story of how he came to know Jesus, but renounced all of that and now speaks on behalf of race relations and is a national speaker, also a professor at Southeast University in Lakeland, Florida. And so thank you for being here as well. So you and Linnell came the furthest to be with us, I think, anyways. And then a good friend of mine is Linnell Pickett, and Dr. Pickett and I got to know each other 13 years ago while we were doing some of our doctoral work in San Francisco. And I didn't know I was going to have a roommate, but he knocked on my door and said, "Hey, my understanding is I'm with you." And I said, "That is great." And the two of us have become great friends and have continued that relationship for many, many years. What's really amazing, not only is he a great pastor, but he is also Dr. Harris's pastor, Richard's pastor as well. So now they serve in the same church. Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church, where Linnell pastors, is a very historical African-American church in the heart of Florida. And so a real treat for us this evening for everybody to be here. So thank you very much. Okay. Yeah. So a couple things real quick. When you came in, hopefully you got one of these. If you didn't, you can raise your hand. We'll get you one. On the back, though, there is something at the bottom that says questions. Now, if you have a question that you would like to pose to the panel, and that would happen toward the end of our evening, if you would just write that down, and in about 20 or 30 minutes, some of our staff, and they have the Magellan blue shirts on, they're going to be walking around, and you can just hand them their question, and they will get that question to me. So, and we won't be able to answer all of them. But we would love to have the opportunity to answer some of those. So, you know that. And then also at the end of our time, we will have the coffee bar open for further discussion and conversation if you'd like. So So let me open up in prayer, and then we're going to kick this thing off. Father, thank you for your goodness and your grace. You are so wonderful. And Lord, we confess that we deeply need your wisdom and discernment this evening and beyond. In so many ways, we are ill-equipped to deal with some of these issues and conversations, yet we know that you are fully equipped. So thank you for bringing us together this evening. In Jesus' name, amen. Now let me be clear what we're after this evening. So this is about the church engaging these issues. The church taking responsibility and engaging racism, bullying, and abuse. And one thing that I know without a shadow of a doubt is arguments aren't going to change people. Right. Yeah. So we're not going to argue up here. And I just encourage you not to argue anyways. Arguments won't change people, but Jesus will. Yes. And he has left his church to be the one who helps facilitate reconciliation and peace. And so for you to be here is important because Jesus wants to use you in this endeavor, this great, worthy endeavor. So we're going to start off, we're going to talk about bullying. We know bullying is an incredible problem. It's an incredible problem in our schools. In fact, as I think back to my own life, I wasn't bullied very often. I remember there was one guy that bullied me. He was a big old guy, and I don't know why he had it out for me, but he bullied me. And what ended up happening is because he bullied me, it perpetuated bullying in my own life. And bullying perpetuates bullying. And so let's spend some time just talking about the problem in and of itself. And it certainly has been a topic in the news recently, Chief Johnson. But talk to us about just the extent of bullying, how common, and even how severe bullying is.
Well, I don't think that you need me to affirm the fact that bullying takes place. I think you see it in pretty much all aspects of your life. You know, most of the time we focus on bullying as it relates to behavior in the childhood age or the teenager age. But quite frankly, bullying can take place at all ages and in all different work settings or school settings. And so we have to look no further than just our own adult interaction to see how we as a society are engaging with one another to see firsthand just exactly what behaviors we're modeling to our kids. And so whenever you see just kind of how adults are acting, it's no shock that the children are replicating this sort of behavior, whether it's being conveyed as appropriate expressly through words, or it's just being modeled as appropriate through the behaviors of adults. But then there's this secondary component, which is just the introduction of technology into the pervasive lives of our kids. And I look at, Eric spoke about, his experiences with bullying. I think all of us have had some negative interaction at some point in our life. I know I have whenever I was growing up. But when I inspect and kind of review the kind of terrain that my own daughters have to face right now, it's vastly different than just the interpersonal aggression that teenagers might face. Because the difference between electronic bullying and in-person bullying is whenever it was solely an interpersonal exercise, you could remove yourself from that and get some relief. Whether you had a different activity or a different set of friends, or maybe you transitioned from middle school to high school, your circle of friends changes and some of the threat and risk that you experience changed. But in the electronic world, there is no relief. It's persistent. It never ends. It's directive. And here's the thing that's probably most concerning, and then I'll just kind of yield the floor, and that's the fact that it magnifies itself through the interactions of others who otherwise would not participate in bullying in real life setting, but you'll like a tweet or you'll retweet or you'll post some divisive issue that it comes at a cost at some individual. And we see that at all age ranges in society right now.
Gosh. Now, David, you've had opportunity not only overseas in a major city like Buenos Aires and as well as in Colombia, and now we see it all throughout South America and other places, the No More Violence movement. But you've also been able to deal with this at some level, even in Dallas and some here. So from your perspective, as you hear what Chief Johnson is saying, how do you affect change? How do you create a different climate that reshapes and addresses bullying?
In Argentina, what we tried to do was to begin to speak out against what we saw. In Argentina, in the world of professional soccer, people get killed because they wear a different jersey than the ones that the gang that's in front of them. And so what we began to do was just to go to the stadiums and, as Christians, and we began to see that by being present, we could see God at work. There's a lot of corruption there. There's a lot of difficult issues that go along with this. But what we began to see is that the presence of God changes things. And it's not just the presence of God because he's omnipresent. It's the presence of his children and his presence in those children at the present where there is violence. And what happened was a big challenge to us as Christians, because the police and the authorities began to tell us that when we were not there, the violence was our fault. Because when we were there was no violence.
What do you think about that, Chief?
Sounds good.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
The challenge is that it requires for us as believers to really believe the words of the Apostle Paul when he said, to live as Christ and to die as gain. I shared earlier today that when we gathered to pray before working the crowd one day, I gathered the group and I said, now remember, if anyone has to die today, it has to be one of us. Because for us to die is gain, but that's not true for them. And so when we put our lives on the line in the name of Jesus is when I believe we actually see his power manifested. And we actually saw riots begin to, or look like it was going to take place. We just simply migrated there praying, and nothing ever happened. So, yes, the presence of God changes things.
That's good. Now, just for clarification perspectives, when you say we're talking the church.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So.
In all seriousness, though, to answer that question about just kind of social norms on outcome-based activities, because basically that's what you were suggesting is when the outcome was positive, everything was great. When the outcome is negative, society looks for somebody to blame. And we see that in the creation of our laws whenever we don't like the outcome that we experience as a society, our first reaction is to legislate our way to a different solution. And that legislative craft will never fix the broken human problem that created it. Right. And so as we look at the concept of bullying and how we treat people, you know, all we have to do is look in our own state of Texas to see the conflict that we have in society. On one hand, we're passing laws as recent as the last legislative session that enhances the requirements for what we should do as a school district and as a community to address bullying. But then on the same hand, we're decriminalizing activity on the schools because we see the disparate outcome as it takes towards students, particularly students in minority communities. And so what it really should show to us as the church, if we go back to the point of the panel, is that legislative solutions are not going to fix a church problem. And the church has got to be engaged to be able to address that in the community.
I guess if you can't say amen, you got to say ouch, right? What are you thinking, Dr. Pickett, as you hear this side of the conversation? What's going through your mind?
I agree wholeheartedly that I read a statement by a pastor, David, out of North Carolina, and he was just talking about character issues and character being the problem, and that you change the character and the hate goes away, whatever that is. And I think I agree with Chief and David that the church gets involved in a number of ways in bullying, and that is, first of all, for me, to pray and to seek God's guidance and help in the matter. And then secondly, to preach the Bible clearly to the people and let them know what Jesus says about the problem of bullying, and then to teach and then encourage our adults and our children to go out and to model right behavior, and also encourage them that they can make an impact with the power of Christ in their lives to change their or at least impact their sphere of influence. So I agree wholeheartedly that it's a situation where we teach, we preach, we mentor, and then we go out and live the right behavior in the workplace and in school and in society where we are.
That's good. So Richard, KKK was a demonic, satanic group. One of their primary activities was bullying. You experienced that in a unique way, and then you were part of that in some respects. And so,
that's right.
Yeah, talk to us about, from your perspective, on an incredible demonic scale through groups like KKK and maybe similar. How do we affect change?
Sure. Bullying is really what kind of drew me into the KKK. I joined the Klan because when I was growing up, I was the little, scrawny, weak, sickly kid. I know you can't believe it now. I'm trying to make up for that now. But I was the one that the schoolyard bullies always picked on. I was one they took the lunch money away from on the playground. And I grew up very, very angry, and I decided somehow, I didn't know how, somehow I was going to have power, and that's a key element of bullying. I wanted power like they had power over me. Somehow I was going to have power, and I was going to get even. Then the Klan recognized that as I became the bully, because when desegregation happened in my school up in Indiana, had been an all-white school, in between 5th and 6th grade, desegregation, now there are African Americans. I had never seen or talked to an African American person in my life, and here I was in middle school, and now there were African American kids in my school, and I looked and saw, these are some people I can start bullying, because they're on my turf. They're in my school, and I did. I became a very outspoken racist, and I was a bully. The Klan was watching me, listening to me, and they came alongside and said, hey, no one will ever pick on you if you become one of us. And so I did. I joined the Klan, and then I learned what bullying was really all about. Because when you're in an organization like that, they bully you with a gun pointed at your head, and it's called, you will obey us, you will do what we tell you to do, or we'll kill you. And it was a whole lot worse than the schoolyard bullying that I had been putting up with. But then they teach you to go out and bully the things that we always talked about: fear, intimidation, and violence. That's the tools of groups like the Klan. They operate like a gang: fear, intimidation, and violence. And that's how they gain control over other people. And really, it all boils down to exactly what we're talking: bullying.
Yeah. One of the parts of your story that most of these folks aren't aware of that I just want to bring to light. You talked about how your mother died when you were 14 years old. It was about the age of 16. You were 16 when you joined the Klan, and the blood signing that took place. But it was interesting to hear you talk, and I've heard you talk about this multiple times, how you were just lonely.
Yes.
You were just, yeah.
Yeah.
Take it from there for a second.
I always say I would have joined the high school chess club if they would have shown an interest in me. I would have joined the church youth group 2 doors down from my house that my whole family, including me, we were members of that church. I would have joined the youth group if they would have reached out and shown some interest in me, but they didn't. And they knew my situation. My 2 brothers were much older. One was a doctor, the other one was in college, so they weren't in the house. My mother had just died unexpectedly. Dad was trying to keep 2 businesses running now. I hardly ever saw him. I was lonely. I didn't have very many friends. I wasn't good at making friends. And the Klan looked at that and said, this is someone that we can woo into our organization. It's the same way. If it's not the Ku Klux Klan, it's the local gang, and they're doing the exact same thing. And with the internet, you mentioned, the chief mentioned the internet. Bullying takes on a whole new realm there, because not only do we have the pervasiveness of it, and you can't get away. I mean, at least when I came home from school, at least I wasn't at school listening to it. I had, a half a day that I could get away from it. You can't really get away from it when it's in technology, because they post something and it's out there. The other thing is, oftentimes it's anonymous, and they don't even know who is picking on them and who is bullying them.
That's good. I want to ask you to give an exhortation to the church about bullying here in a second, but I just want to point out, not to throw shade at the church, but for us to recognize the simplicity sometimes that can create change. As much as an invitation, as much as walking across the street and an introduction and invitation back home or to your table or to your church can change the course of history for somebody and transform a city, and can certainly transform neighborhoods. What's your exhortation for us as we...
I think that's very important what Dr. Harris mentioned, in that the church really has to have a passion and a heart to reach out to people. I have a very good friend of mine that pastors a church, and it was a kind of upscale church and had a reputation for being kind of an upscale church. And his wife wanted to start a youth group and reach out to some youth in some projects and in some of the more economic parts of the city around the church. And so they did, but what happened was when the children started coming in, they were a little rambunctious, and they were not, quote, your regular Sunday school kids, and their behavior was not oftentimes appropriate, and so there was pushback on behalf of church leadership. And of course, as Dr. Harris brought out, if there's pushback on children because they don't necessarily behave, or they come from homes where there's brokenness, there's heartache, there's heartbreak, and they're looking for a place to be accepted, and they look over at the church yard and they see people, children over there playing, and they think, well, I want to join this group. But then when they come, well, you don't look like our children, and you're not Sunday school material, and you don't really fit in, and they get this pushback. And again, of course, gangs are there or other negative groups, and they say, hey, we'll take you in, and therein lies some of the problems. So back to your point is, for me, I love to see our church. I love to see churches engage in culture, meeting them like Jesus did wherever they are, and then helping them work through those very difficult issues that they have. And children have a lot of difficult issues. All of them don't come from neat little package homes where moms and dads are there teaching them the right way. They need the church.
Yeah, it's good. It's good. Let me remind you, we're going to move toward abuse here in a second. If you have a question, write that down, and here in a moment, we'll pick those up. But let's talk about abuse, kind of move the needle a little bit from where we've been. One of the great organizations here in Arlington is Alliance for Children, and they specifically deal with child abuse, and phenomenal organization and well-led. Sadly, business is good for them. It's an incredible problem. In fact, I serve on the board there, and I found out the other day the Tarrant County, it's a Tarrant County group, but the zip code is 76016. It's one of the top 5 most reported areas of child abuse. You're sitting in 76016 right now. Heartbreaking to know that. And I want us to just talk, there's a bunch of different forms of abuse, and I want us to talk about a couple of those shortly. One is domestic violence, and then one is child abuse. And Chief, talk to us some about the problem that you see with this in the city.
Well, if you had the opportunity this morning to worship here at LABC, you know Dr. Pickett used the example of celebrating to the Lord, much like we celebrate whenever the Dallas Cowboys score a touchdown, right? And instantaneously, there was connection all throughout the church. And there were giggles and laughs, and everybody understood precisely the point that he was trying to make. But sadly, though, I was sitting there thinking, I understand the flip side of that, which is domestic violence goes up as the Cowboys lose. I'll just let that sink in for just a minute. Here in this community, we respond to over 10,000 incidents of domestic violence every year. About 45% of those are criminal. And as you're reconciling those 2 points, what's the difference between an incident of domestic violence and a criminal act of domestic violence? Well, it's not against the law to get into a verbal argument with your spouse, but it obviously is against the law if you use the threat of violence or violence with a domestic partner. And we respond to many, many types of conflict. But from a church perspective, you know, when we talk about whether it's child abuse or we talk about domestic abuse, we talk about sexual assaults, these are topics that are not restricted to that part of town. These are not topics that are restricted to areas of maybe less socioeconomic advantages that maybe you might enjoy. These are sorts of offenses that are interwoven throughout the entire fabric of the community, including the church. And the church has a responsibility to not only understand that, but to act upon that and to identify that as you engage people coming into houses of worship, because it may be, as Harris said, you know, reaching out to somebody so that they could be included whenever they have no hope, right? Or it may be that they are coming in. I think, you know, Casting Crowns had a song one time about plastic people. You know, how many plastic people are sitting in the pew right next to you, and you're not even acknowledging because we're kind of blind to it because we think this is a safe place where everybody's life is perfectly in order, and that's not always true.
So I think the capillaries are starting to rise in my face as we continue to talk about this. Why do you think, I mean, it ought to be obvious to us that this is a problem in the church as well as in the community, because there's so much abuse that happens even within the church. But why do you think the church has stuck its head in the sand on this particular issue for so long?
I think Dr. Pickett, really kind of pointed it out. The church is not really good. I mean, if we really are self-critical about ourselves and to kind of how the mechanics of church, we don't do well with things that don't fit into its place. And so, whether it's not the right kids coming to the right program, or it's not the right music for the service, or it's not, you're not wearing the right.
Preach.
Yeah, you're not wearing the. Is this your Monday morning inbox?
Come on.
It's not the right clothes that somebody wears, and then you sprinkle onto it whenever you check the right box for all those topics, but then you had this one outlier that seems to be the relationship is off, and sometimes we're dismissive about, well, maybe they're just going through a hard time, or they're trying to reconcile, or all the things that because churches are people happen. That we don't necessarily intervene to the level that we do. And what research tells me as a police chief, and something that you should know, is the more people that are around whenever an offense is happening, the fewer people report it. Because everybody thinks that somebody else is going to do it. That somebody else is going to take that initiative, that somebody else is in a better position to have access to the information. They're in a better position to articulate what they saw. I heard this, but that's probably not what it meant, and I don't want to be intrusive into somebody's life. And so we largely fall prey to that psychology phenomenon, which allows things to be permissive even inside the church.
Yeah, thank you. David, I have your permission to ask this question, and it's been an incredible couple of weeks for you and your entire family. So many of you may have seen on the news that in Mesquite there was a child care worker in a licensed home, and she was only licensed to have 6 children in her home. She had 9 in her home, and they were drugging the children, and in some cases tying them up and putting them, or tying them down and putting them in the closet. In fact, when the police came, they found 3 of those children in the closet, and one of those was your grandchild. Talk to us about how this issue hits you just right now.
Definitely, it's a punch in the gut that just is heavy. It's a tremendous heavy load to carry. One, because you wish you could have been there before. You wish you could have seen it before. You wish you could have stopped it. You wish you had known about it and prevented it. So you have to go through a list of things that your mind rushes to all these thoughts that I wasn't there, that I could have, that I should have, and then God begins to speak into it, and the first thing I can say honestly that after my mind rushes is I was very grateful for the parent who put a camera in their child's car seat that brought all this to light. I was so grateful that God had allowed it to come out so that none of those children would be further harmed, including our grandchild, of course. As a family, it's been very difficult. All of us want to provide answers. I haven't found any except that God is sovereign, and somehow, some way He will, as Dr. Pickett, we shared a story, all things do work together for good, and I don't know how long we'll have to wait to find out how He will work for good. I don't know, but I trust what He says. Doesn't make it less difficult. But I want to tell you a story. When we worked the stadium in Argentina, there was a young man that saw a child as the gang was approaching, and he went and tried to get that child out of the way of the gang, and a gang member went to him and hit him to the ground. And I went to Gustavo and I said, "Are you okay?" And he was weeping. And I said, "Are you okay? Does it hurt?" He says, "I'm not crying for me." He was weeping. He says, "How much hate, what has to happen in that person's heart to make them want to do this?" And so the takeaway for me today, right now, I can say, what in the world goes through someone's mind? What has happened in their life that causes them to want to inflict such harm on someone else? And as a church, as a David Balliet, what could I have done, if anything? I don't know. But as a church, there is an element of the church that I think we omit and we don't focus on, and that is the preventative role that the church has. We react very well. We're very compassionate when people go through harm. But we're supposed to also be there beforehand. Yeah. In Jesus, we have all the authority in heaven and on earth, and that's why he sends us out. I don't think the church exercises that authority all the time wherever we are. And I mean me when I speak of that.
Thank you for sharing that. Pastor Pickett, so we know, and David began to point this out, I mean, the massive amount of hate and hurt that would be in a person's life. What we know is that oftentimes those who are abusing or expressing violence, it's been a learned behavior. They have experienced that in their own family system or in some type of relational environment. So it's a cyclical pattern that continues until somebody breaks the cycle. How does the church step in more than just being on the other side of things and walking with compassion, which is incredibly important, but how does the church step in and begin to break the cycle of violence and abuse in the city?
Well, I think, one of the things is we're seen as very compassionate and loving, and we are. And so we teach people that, and we model it. But also, I believe that the church, 21st century church, as we move further in the future, will need to do a better job creating a cultural environment within the church of responsibility. About a month or so ago, I was out at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and I saw a sign that said, "If you see something, say something." And that the church for a long time has been seen as a place for perpetrators of abuse to ply their trade and get away with it. And they see children in the church as a target, sometimes women. And so, and I know these other pastors do the same thing. But in our church, everybody that works with our young people or in leadership, they know that they're going to do a background check. And our association office will do that. So we don't give people access to our children just because they say they love the Lord and they want to work with children. And not only that, but we've created an environment in our church whereas we expose. So people know if things are going on, it's going to be exposed. Real quickly, about a couple years ago, we had one of our church leaders accused of inappropriate comments towards a child. And so we got the right people together, the leaders together. We prayed through it. We called him in, and we told him that it has been reported. Okay, it has been reported. And then I, as the pastor, had to go before the church and explain to them the steps that we had taken. We were not accusing him, but what we were saying is that this has happened, And so you're going to be relieved from the jobs that you have. And we talked with him, prayed with him, loved him. He understood that. But at the same time, it sent a very strong message through our church and throughout the community and wherever this story is told, that Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church will not tolerate spousal abuse. We will not tolerate child abuse. And if it is discovered, and it will be, we will report it, and law enforcement will be involved. And we'll pray for you, and we'll help you, and we'll counsel you and help you get counseling. But we're going to handle this matter very, very seriously and very responsibly. And I think our women feel safe, and I think parents feel a lot better about sending their children. Now, are we perfect? No. Do we have all the answers? No. Can something slip through the cracks? It certainly will. But we definitely won't stand before a judge and have a judge ask us, did you do criminal background checks on people, and what protective measures did you have in place? Did you have these things in place? Our answer will be yes. So I think we need to be very compassionate, but at the same time, that compassion is both sides for those who may be victimized. And we just need to let people know that we're serious about it. We love you, but this is not a safe place for you to ply a trade of any kind of abuse.
Yeah, that's a good word. You mentioned this, the very fact we live in a sinful world. We can have the best systems in place,
Sure.
and still things can can happen. But one of the things without question, and I didn't get to preach this morning, so I'm going to take a little bit time here. And but I have, when the church loses focus of its purpose to go and make disciples, then we are not affecting change in our own church, and we are not affecting change in the community. And anyway, before I get to preaching, you have the last word on this. What would you say to the church as some
I was just going to say we got out early this morning.
Man, woo! That's true, and that's fair. Yeah, we did. Yeah, nobody was patting you on the back this morning to tell you to keep going, man. Gee, so that's fair. But what would you say to the church? What are some practical things that we've got to do and be as the church as we move forward in addressing this?
I think it really is about focusing on what you opened up with. This is not about being right. This is not about convincing people of your position. This is not about, the finer points of doctrine about what, the church or the denomination stands for. This is about being part of the universal church. Mm. This is about being the hands and feet of God in the community and being the light in a very dark world. And so it's about showing up and just staying positive, and I think about the simple things, in government, what we can't do is we cannot prophesize. We can't pick one faith over another faith. But if you look at the threads of belief systems that people have throughout the community, whether they're Christian or not, there's a lot of commonalities too, that the church can find commonalities even with those people that don't believe the same thing maybe that we believe in. And that's where things like the Mayor's Kindness Initiative come in, about the fact that kindness helps address some of these issues that we're talking about by being proactive rather than reactive. And I think that really speaks to what you were talking about, because we're, not to cast shade on any missionary program, but we're real good about stocking some trailers and going to where the hurricanes are, right? Because that's easy. It's not easy in terms of it's not physical and it doesn't take logistics and work, but it's a tangible task that you can do. You start talking about addressing untangible tasks that are pervasive, like bullying, child abuse, sex abuse. When we start talking about racism issues in a minute, that's hard. Yeah. It's hard, and it's not easy to just, check the box to say that we've done it, right? I mean, it takes consistent, repetitive, overlapping sort of initiatives from every church member to be able to address. And whenever you do it, you might do it your whole life and you only get an incremental rate of return, right? And so you can feel frustrated that the rate of change isn't as dramatic as 50 men showing up with a semi-trailer and helping people in a time of desperation. That's needed, but really, when you think about what the universal church needs to be doing, it needs to be about addressing all of these social fabrics, because this might be the only hope some people ever get to see. And I just shared with Eric this week, you know, right now, if you just pick up a headline of any major newspaper across the United States over the last 5 years, there's going to be some topic about law enforcement. People either supporting us or not supporting us, talking about uses of force or non-uses of force, talking about ambush of officers, or talking about the disproportionate use of force in the African American community. That's what the newspaper is going to be all about, and that's what people's focus has been. But if you look at people that bring scientific measurements about the attitudes of the American people, law enforcement is in the top 3 institutions in the United States in terms of public trust. Sadly, the church is not. The church is not. So even with all the conflict that surrounds law enforcement right now, we need to be focused on what matters, which is the church relevant? Is the church even in the game? Are we actively addressing social issues collectively to be able to make communities stronger? And I know that we are, but I know that we can do so much more than we are right now.
I agree. Good word. We're going to move into a discussion with racism, and if you had a question that you wrote down, would you just hold it up, and one of our staff members will just grab it, and we'll try our best to get to that. While y'all are doing that, let me invite Mayor Williams. Would you come up? And let me also point out that Mayor Williams was voted in by our city for quite a few merits, but his wife, Karen, though, is probably the reason why he's mayor. You know? And, yeah, well, if there was a professional hugger and somebody who is one of the most hospitable people I have ever been around, Karen, you are delightful. So thank you for being here tonight, and love you, and we do. We love you as well, Mayor Williams, so thank you. It's unique that we can have a mayor on a panel like this when we're addressing the church, because most mayors don't believe in the one true God. You know, they don't have a Christian worldview, so it's a real it's a great opportunity for us this evening to have you here, and so thank you very much. So let's talk racism for a bit. You know, well, I think we've said a lot about the issues and battles that we are talking about. These cannot simply be fixed with better systems, better government. There has to be responsibility that is taken by the church. These are spiritual issues, because abuse is a demonic thing. Bullying is a satanic thing. And racism is that as well. And so the only hope for there to be reconciliation and redemption is for Jesus to be made known and transformation to be had. And so here's where we are as we begin kind of this discussion. Pastor Pickett, talk to us. You grew up in South Carolina. Right. Talk to us a little bit about what it was like growing up in that culture, some of the encounters that you had with people, maybe even the police at points. And, you know, you are well-educated, military man, and you experience some uniqueness that maybe some of us have never experienced before. And so talk to us a little bit about that, because again, there's this, sadly, the church again has stuck its head in the sand on this issue, and I hate to use the term black church, white church, all that, because it's not biblical. But those churches that have the tendency to have more white people, we have especially stuck our head in the sand in this. And we've chosen at times not to listen to the historical aspects of racism. So talk to us a little bit about your experience.
Well, I grew up in South Carolina, and I was basically raised by my grandparents. And my situation was, I guess, somewhat different. I'm 62 years old, so you can kind of do the math and figure out the era that I grew up in. My community was segregated. And so it was a situation where I went to all-black elementary school, middle school, and high school. We had businesses, we had, in the community. And so when integration started, I think we talked about this a little bit, the white kids were bussed in to our community. And, we were the majority, if you will. And so it was unique in that the white kids that made it were either athletes and, of course, the black football players and the coaches took good care of them, or they were a part of the hippie kind of movement. They wore patches, and some of the white kids even could wear afros, and they fit in well. The other group were the kids that really didn't fit well. And so back to bullying, they were bullied. Now, my grandparents, even though we lived in a very racist society, never taught me to be a racist. I would sit there and watch black and white television, watch Klan marches and what have you. But my grandparents were Christians, and they taught me to love people and taught me that it was more about my character and about the love of Jesus Christ. And so I found myself, when there were fights and white kids were being beat up, feeling compassion for them and not wanting to hurt them in any way, even though I felt powerless at times. I didn't participate in that. Now, when I went across Two Notch Road, went into the white section, it was pretty easy for me because, like my friends that, we basically knew our place. If I went to a certain neighborhood, I went in there with a rake in my hand or a lawnmower. So, but then later on in life, when I came out of that, that's when I experienced, racism at a different level. For example, when I joined the military at 24 years old. I went in as a chaplain, and I bought a beautiful sports car. And so on my day off, my wife and I were riding through Fort Lauderdale, just sightseeing, and out of nowhere, police stopped me, and there was one African-American police with them, about 4 white officers. They were extremely nice to me. They wanted to see my license, registration. I showed it to them, and they just laughed and said, well, there been thefts of these kind of cars. That's the reason why we stopped you. And so, and again, in the military, experiencing racism, through, unfair treatment. But my situation was somewhat different because I was not beat up by white people when I was growing up, again, because my neighborhood was very, very protective. And yet, that was not the story for many of my friends. It's a very, very, very painful thing. And I think the church has a responsibility, again, to speak out against racism, to preach the truth of what Jesus said about race relations, and just practice, loving each other. And as you said, Pastor Hurstrom, again, I believe that racism is a character issue. Stephen Davey brought that out. He said, it's not about color, it's about character. Change the character, and the hate goes away. And I agree with what the chief said. It's not about programs, even though that helps. You can't legislate that. The church is extremely important because somehow or another we have to get the word out to people about Jesus, and Jesus actually does the transformation of hearts.
Chief, do you find that there is still a systemic problem of racism today?
The short answer is yes. The more complex answer is this is a topic where history matters. And so when you look at racism and institutionalized racism, and what does that really mean? Institutionalized racism really means that the majority has constructed laws, practices, or procedures to maintain the status quo. I mean, if we look at Jim Crow laws of the South, that's exactly what they were, and that's some of the darkest times for law enforcement's history, because law enforcement enforces the law. But when the law is corrupt, morally corrupt, and devoid of constitutional protections, then it creates all kinds of problems. And so, as you ask the question now, does it still exist? Yes. Have many of those institutions been challenged, attacked, and changed? Yes. But the overarching historical perspective, when introduced into today's setting, also creates the opportunity for doubt and for the questioning of motive to take place, even if things are better than where they historically were. And I would just kind of give you the best example, and maybe play off Dr. Pickett's sort of example about being stopped. So if I get stopped by a police officer, and that police officer is rude, right? 100% rude. When we get done with that traffic stop, I drive off and I say, that guy was a jerk. And that's basically the extent of kind of how I characterize that interaction. But if Dr. Pickett gets stopped by that same officer and he's a jerk, when he drives off, he has to ask a second question, which is why? Why was the guy a jerk? In my traffic stop, I wasn't asking why the guy was a jerk. Frankly, I didn't care. The guy was a jerk. But people of color, they always have to ask that question of why. Why? And why do they have to ask that question? Because of history. And so when we talk about addressing racism, we cannot approach the conversation without a firm understanding and acknowledgement of the historical perspective that contributes, and the fact that, one more thing, the fact that typically white folks view history in a linear fashion. You know, it's a chronology that's on a timeline, and I can say, and you know, at X year these things happened, and X year these things happened. African American history is much different. You know, one, because it wasn't institutionalized in school books like white history was, and so it was more of an oral history. And so it's much more generational in certain terms of its conversation. And so if I ask people, you know, how have we come from desegregation in Arlington, if you talk to the white community, you will get the answer of, oh, it's so much better. You talk in the African American community, you can still go to the lady's house who was the first African American student in a Mansfield Independent School District, because she still lives in our community. And she went on to become the first African American teacher in the school district that previously wouldn't let her be a student in, right? And she's still alive, attending church, working, going to the grocery store in our community. And so that story is much more conversational than kind of a linear sort of academic experience. And so it brings complexities to have public discussions about it, because people they approach the topic from totally different perspectives, and they have to be able to understand and listen to be able to appreciate people's experiences, because it might be both truths are true as people are reconciling their experiences.
Good word. So I think we've affirmed that there is an aspect of systemic as well as institutional and historical racism that is a part of our culture, who we are. You know, Richard, I've heard you talk a lot about, and you've already shared some tonight about this, but the individual responsibility, going back to what Dr. Pickett was talking about in terms of shaping one's character. Talk to us a little bit about that. I mean, what role do we have individually and then as a church to address this?
All right. Let me talk about as a church first. You know, we have been too comfortable, too quiet, too complacent for way too long on all three of these issues that we're addressing tonight, whether it be abuse or bullying, and definitely racism. And when you look, and I understand the white church, black church, but we still have white churches and black churches in this country. So when you look at the history of the white church, we're seeing exactly as our police chief talked about, because there is a history. You know, next year is going to be the 400th anniversary of the first African slaves arriving on the shores of what will become the United States. 400 years. But after slavery ended, then we come into Jim Crow. After Jim Crow, we think everything is just fine, and the church has basically dug its head in the sand one more time and said, everything's okay, we don't need to talk about this, and we haven't talked about it. And we've got to start talking. But not only talking, we've got to start listening. And one of the things, I teach a course right now, I'm teaching at the university, interracial communication. Cultures, races communicate differently. We've got to start understanding that. And there's no better place than to model that in the church. But I'll tell you what, when you look out and all you see are people the same race as what you on the platform are, and that's it, there's a big part of the problem. I cannot imagine what this man sitting next to me, I cannot imagine how he must have felt and what he must have thought the day or night that he approached the church board at Good Hope and said, hey, I've got an idea. Let's bring the former Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan on board and make him one of our pastors. I cannot even imagine what that was like for you. But that's exactly the kinds of things that have got to happen with the church. The church has got to start taking these issues seriously. And then you asked about, you know, an individual responsibility. I'll tell you a story really. I'll try to be quick about it. All right. I love this story. I was speaking in let's just say it was a Midwestern state. They had, I won't say which one. They brought me in, and the community brought me in because there have been some real racial tensions in that particular, it's a large city. They brought me in, and so I had just spent an hour talking about the importance of making friendships across racial lines, making real friendships. And this lady, it was Q&A. This lady stands up in the audience. There's a couple thousand people there, and she says, Dr. Harris, I so appreciate your talk that you just gave, and maybe you can help me with this. And she's a white lady. I said, all right, what? She said, a black family just moved into my neighborhood. She says, I know that the housing prices are going to go down. I know crime is going to go up. And they have children who are riding the same school bus as my children. And so, Dr. Harris, I think you're going to understand and be able to tell me, what should I do? I almost walked off the stage and said, you know, I'm done. I'm never going to step on the stage again. She had just listened to me for an hour. And so it was everyone, you could hear a pin drop in that audience. I said, ma'am, I know exactly what you need to do. I said, this family, they have children. They're obviously about the same age as your children, right? Because they're riding the same school bus. Yes. And you said they bought their home. They're not renting it, but they bought it. Yes. I had a funny feeling she could probably tell me exactly how much they paid to the penny. I said, all right, that's what I needed to know. So what that tells me is you probably picked your neighborhood to live in because it's a safe, good, nice place to raise a family. I'm guessing they picked your neighborhood for the same reason. Not only that, but you have children about the same age. You're of the same socioeconomic level because you're living in the same neighborhood. You have got so much in common with this new family. I don't know whether it's cookies or a pie or cake, whatever it is that you do best. Make something, buy something, go over and welcome your new neighbors to the neighborhood, because I'm thinking you've got so much in common that you could become really good friends. That's exactly what the rest of the couple 1,000 or 2,000 people there in the audience, that's exactly what they did. She got up and she promptly left. We've got to start taking it on individually, personal responsibility about doing something about the situation ourselves, because we can't let it be done by our neighbor, because the neighbor isn't going to do it. It's up to you. It's up to me. We have got to do something. I applaud this man. This man came to me and basically said, put your money where your mouth is. Come join my staff. And let's build a church together. And let's model good interracial communication, good interracial relationships. Let's model it for the world in hopes that they will catch on and start seeing how we can relate to one another.
Thank you. That's good. I love our city. You know, I grew up here. I was born at Arlington Memorial. I grew up on the north side of town in a cul-de-sac off of Green Oaks. I now live on the south side of town in a cul-de-sac off of Green Oaks. I went to Lamar High School. Now I got a root for Martin. But I love our city. And I'm proud of our city, not just because of the numerous just benefits that are a result of great leadership, but there has been a culture that's been created here that I'm thankful for because of men like you and Chief, you know, our Chief of Fire. He is also a believer, Don Krausen. And so just grateful for the culture that has been created here. Jeff, talk to us a little bit about how you have seen people and entities and groups in the city kind of reach across to one another. Because we've certainly had the opportunities here for there to be major blow-ups. And I'm proud of how our city has responded on occasion. So talk to us about what you've seen.
Well, it's been very encouraging here to get to see our city as a whole. You know, Karen and I have lived here for 30 years, but we have learned a whole lot in coming in here and to serve this city. There were two things that were very impressive to me in coming into office, and that was, one, our pastors were and ministers were taking a leadership role and getting along. You know, that had not been the case here in our city in years past. And they were promoting great unity here among the citizens and their congregations. And then the other thing is that Chief Johnson really had set a great model for building community trust and building relationships here in our neighborhoods. And it was an amazing thing to see that. But then yet we have challenges, and we know that. but yet also I know that unity is the most important thing in the church. It's also the most important thing in a community. And so there was work to be done, and it was pretty eye-opening when I was visiting with Pastor McKissick over at Cornerstone, talking to him about this very item, and he said, well, Mayor, we hear from a lot of people. They talk a lot about unity, but then they don't do anything. He said one of the first things you've got to do is you've got to straighten out our MWBE policies. Well, it was amazing how the leadership around this community came together on that, and now we have made headway in that one area, but more importantly, it opened the door for more dialogue and more understanding and more opportunity for us to work together. I loved what Dr. Harris said about being intentional, that we have got to work at it. Well, here is an example of what I'm talking about, is that a friend of mine owns a bed and breakfast in North Arlington. She is an Asian American. And when I first came into, it's Sunny Graham. Many of y'all know her. Well, Sunny told me, she said, I want to have some friends over. She said, I can have about 40 people here and to get to know you and to meet you. And she said, a lot of these people you won't know. Well, I'm immediately thinking that I am going to be meeting 40 new Asian Americans that I don't know. Well, when I arrived, I saw about 40 different ethnicities represented in that room. And I thought, well, Sonny had been real intentional about trying to reach out to different parts of the community. Well, no, these were all her friends. She has been intentional about becoming friends and developing relationships with people that don't look like her, people that are different. And y'all, that is so important right now because Arlington, Texas is an international community. We have 100 countries represented here right now, and it's going to increase. The University of Texas at Arlington is a big reason for that. They are the 5th most diverse university in the country, and we are the 3rd most diverse in the state. Well, we have got to work at it, and we have got to be intentional, but think about the advantage of that. Think about the opportunity for us to learn about another family that is very different from us and what that can bring to us in the fabric, and to learn new cultures and to learn new ways that can be so much better and broaden our breadth. And most important of all, that's the Jesus way. That's what he has shared with us to do. And then in Ephesians 2 and 3, it becomes very clear that we are definitely supposed to be reaching out, and that all of us are the same in God's eyes, and that we are all children of God. And then the last thing I'll say is that whenever I go into the schools, that's one of my favorite things to do, and especially the elementary schools. They see no color. They haven't been jaded yet there. And, of course, it's important for us as parents and grandparents to try to help that. But they set an incredible example there, and it's amazing the relationships that are being developed. And I'm looking forward to the future because I'm hopeful if we work at it hard and we develop, we can reduce. It's a hard thing to ever say eliminate, but we can reduce. But the only way we're going to reduce is to be intentional and work at it and call upon the strength of God to come into this, because Jesus is the answer for us, and to use the same methods that he used in developing relationships with people and building trust.
Thank you, Mayor. David, I want to get your perspective on something. You and I have traveled all over the world, and I've been to about 40 different countries, and what I find is that racism exists in every single country. In fact, in many cases, it far exceeds what we experience here in America. And, as Jeff was talking about the opportunity that we have in schools, you saw the church affect schools that in such a unique and powerful way through the movement that God birthed through you, that the president of Argentina called and said, hey, we don't just want this movement at soccer stadiums, but we want to know how it can be taught in all of our elementary schools. So here we are as pastors in neighborhoods. We all have multiple schools that surround us. Talk to us about how that began, and how would you encourage us? Let's talk about schools, going straight to our youth, and what does that look like?
Well, the first thing we had to learn was that Jesus has all the authority.
Yeah.
We always typically begin the Great Commission with verse 19. It says, "Go ye therefore," but verse 19 and 20 don't mean anything without verse 18. And the reason why that was important is because in Argentina, it's a Catholic country. It's a pretty much a secular country in that regard. And so for evangelical Christians to imagine being able to go into public schools and say something that would be out of the Bible but in an indirect form was really thinking about a miracle. And so what we found was we had to overcome that it wasn't the city, the state that had the last word. It was Jesus Christ that had the last word. And so we, armed with that, we were able to develop material. People that know how to do that developed it. And so we began to teach biblical principles in a parabolized form to respect the fact that you can't openly speak about Jesus in public schools. But we did anyway, just as spies, if you will. And what happened was the realities they lived in the schools were so bad that they didn't know what else to do. And so as we began to work in the schools, and the principals, teachers, parents began to see the changes in the students, they were like, "Please come in." And after several years of this, there has been a law that was passed that in one of the provinces that the material has to be taught in the public school setting. The church has to overcome the idea that when we go to the school, that's going to help increase the membership of our church. We have to overcome that, because what's important is they need to know that what we really want to do is reduce the violence in the school. We want to reduce bullying in the school. We really care about doing that. And that will produce fruit that they're going to want to know who these people are. The volunteers that come when it rains, sleet, shine, or snow, they're always there. They're always doing what they said they would do. They always have a smile on their face. There was one principal, Norberto and Andrea, worked in this school. And it's been consistent for 14 years, if I'm not mistaken. They've had continual presence in the school. Well, when you do that, the spiritual climate changes in the school. There's a ripple effect into the families. But the work began because they held the principal at gunpoint in his office. That principal had heard about the No More Violence movement, and so he called the local church that had been connected to it and said, "Hey, we need your help, please." And that totally changed. That principal has accepted Christ. Those people, those young people have totally changed their lives, and that's had a ripple effect in the community as well. And that's multiplied. We're in 10 different countries now seeing that happen. Change happens one heart at a time. And when we go in the authority of Jesus Christ, he gives us the ability to speak into hearts, because they've seen the change in our heart, and we're able to reach across into any life that we come across. We have to have the courage to do it. And I think culture, you didn't ask me this, but I wanted to say that one of the issues I found as we do travel is learning about other cultures. I think is a way of overcoming fear of a person that's not like me. And I think the more that we get to know people from other cultures, the more insight we have of who God is, because he created us. And so there's a story about a couple on their honeymoon. The wife said, "I'm going to fix you breakfast in the morning, honey, and it's going to be eggs, bacon, toast, and hot coffee." And he got all lit up. He was so excited. The next morning, he wakes up to the smell of the coffee and the bacon, and goes out, and she proudly serves it up, puts the plate in front of him, and he looks down and says, "What's this?" She started crying, runs off, closes the door to the bathroom, weeping. See, it was eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. It just wasn't how his mom had prepared it. And I think the difference in culture that we have, I often hear the term our culture, or in our country or in our city. And which one are we talking about? Which one? Because that depends on where the family came from, what their history, what country of origin, and so it's a very broad issue, and we have to have the desire to enter into the adventure of learning about other cultures. And I think that'll help break down barriers and create bridges between people, between cultures. And it's very exciting to learn why people do what they do.
That's a good word. I feel like we bit off more than we could chew tonight. And I do want to honor, we had some great questions. Let me ask one more question that's from the audience. I don't know who wrote it, but I'm going to pose it to you, Linnell. And then what I'd like us to do, we're going to, after you answer this question, I want us to close in a time of prayer. And so this may be unique for some of you, and for others this may be just normal. But I want us as the body of Christ just to pray aloud together here in a moment. You may have your eyes open. You may have them closed. You may be kneeling. You may be standing. The person next to you is going to be praying out loud. Don't listen to what they have to say. You just pray to the Creator God Himself. And I want us to just take some time as the body of Christ to pray about these issues, to ask Jesus to intervene in our life, that we would take personal responsibility to speak into our heart about how do we lead our churches, our small groups, our home, our schools, our workplaces, to recognize that we are all image bearers of the King, and therefore there is intrinsic value in all people, and so we will love them as Jesus loved them when He created them. So, and then I'll close in prayer, and then after that, I'd love to just invite you. There's some things outside in the foyer for you to take if you'd like further conversations with some of us there at the coffee bar. There will be some folks. Dr. Harris has a award-winning book that he has written. If you would like a copy of that and to talk further with any of us, let me invite you out there. But so here's the question: what is Good Hope doing to bring the races together?
One of the things that we're doing is we, just a few weeks ago, we looked at Acts chapter 13, verse 1. And in that verse, it gives the makeup of the Antioch church. The Antioch church was a very diverse church with diverse leadership. You had, five different people in that church. And one of the things we found out was that God used the Antioch church in Acts chapter 13 to become the evangelistic and mission, the worldwide evangelistic and mission headquarters for that day. And part of the reason why he did that, the research shows, is that the Jerusalem church was not ready. The Jerusalem church was not ready. So one of the things that we do is we have been intentional about diversifying our leadership, and we just believe that by modeling love of all people, by, as David said, preaching and teaching in the authority of Jesus Christ, we can engage culture and we can reach the world. So again, we've just been very intentional about it, and we're just trusting God to use that as we reach across the racial as well as cultural as well as educational divide. In fact, Chief, you'd appreciate this. We just got an award from the city of Bartow, a diversity award. And one of the statements in that award, it says that Good Hope Missionary Baptist Church is a very diverse congregation in that we have former convicted felons, law enforcement officers, and of course, we have everybody from GEDs to PhDs, and it's something that God is doing, and it's something that we're excited about.
Amen. Good. Man, thank you very much for taking an evening to speak into this. Thank you so very much. So appreciate y'all being here. And church, let's take a moment. Let's just pray together. Let's just pray. Pray aloud. Jesus, we recognize that we are saved by grace, that we stand as a convicted felon ourselves and in front of a just judge that is you, perfect in every way. And yet by your mercy, not by our merit, you have saved us. You made us intrinsically valuable, not because of the color of skin, not because of a degree, not because of a family system, but rather you made us intrinsically valuable because when you created man and woman, you just said, it's good. And by your word, by your perfect word, you have made us in your image. So Lord, we thank you. Now Father, would you help us be churches and the church and a city that brings to light these issues, but also redemptive action. That we would recognize that in your authority and in your power, that you and the church would speak into racism and bullying and abuse. And that not only would we stand in the gap as churches and as followers of you, but that we would walk sacrificially, that even if it means our life, that we'd be willing to give it. Father, I pray for the pastors in here and our city leaders. Lord, that you would speak into them, into us in such a way that we would continue to walk with the convictions of you, Jesus. That we would do that with grace. That we would do that with humility. But it would be with a stubborn humility. So, Father, thank you for what you have done in us. May we be faithful in expressing that to the city and to the world. In Jesus' name, amen.